All right, so I think in the interest of time, we'll begin. Welcome everybody to the final day of the 14th annual Schoenberg Symposium. I believe the past 2 days have really been extraordinarily rich, or provide extraordinarily rich opportunities to explore the theme of loss. And I'm sure today will be no exception. We are starting with a workshop on the project Cultivate Manuscripts. We have 2 papers following the workshop treating the important topics of trauma and conflict by Matt Aiello and Hegnar Wattenpaugh. And then following that, we will, after a midday break, we'll have Elaine Traharn's keynote address on the senses and seduction of loss starting at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I do want to just give you an update about the videos. Some of the videos have required a little bit of editing, and so I have not been able to post them, and I'm going to try and do that over the weekend and get videos up early next week. And I think we'll go ahead and start. It's my pleasure to introduce Laura Cleaver, and the leader of today's workshop, who will then introduce her team. Laura is currently the Senior Lecturer in Manuscript Studies at the Institute of English Studies at the University of London. Prior to this position, she was a lecturer in art history at Trinity College, Dublin. And in this field has published widely, including her books, Illuminated History Books in the Anglo-Norman World, 1066 to 1272, which was published in 2018. And Education in 12th Century Art and Architecture, Images of Learning in Europe, circa 1100 to 1220, which was published in 2016, among many other articles and edited collections. But it was at Trinity where I believe she first fell down the rabbit hole of provenance studies with a project that was begun in 2015 with the Chester Beatty Library to explore the trade in Western medieval manuscripts, principally in London in the early 20th century through the lens of Sir Alfred's collection. However, as anyone who's done any work in provenance studies knows, that rabbit hole of Beatty's collection soon led her into the rabbit warren of the tangled and complicated networks of the trade and collection of pre-modern manuscripts throughout Europe and in North America in the first half of the 20th century. To help her find her way out, the European Research Council awarded her with a grant beginning in 2019 to fund the project Cultivate Manuscripts, which has allowed her to bring together a team of scholars to assess the significance of the trade in medieval manuscripts for the development of ideas about the nature and value of European culture in the early 20th century. While Laura's resume is impressive on its own terms, I feel compelled to add, as the manager of the Schoenberg database of manuscripts, another contribution to the field of manuscript studies that she and her team have made since the beginning of the pandemic. And that is the contribution of over 5,000 new entries to the Schoenberg database and over 10,000 corrections, comments, links, and additions and corrections to the database's name and place authorities as part of the work of the Cultivate Manuscripts Project. And you saw that yesterday in Natalia's talk. Thanks to this work, our data on the movements of European manuscripts between 1900 and 1945 is robust and ready for further research. Their work with us has been a model of collaboration, and I look forward to hearing more about the results of their research in this session. So with that, I will hand it over to Laura.
Thank you very much, Lynn. It's been a great joy to work with you on the Schoenberg database, and I'm enjoying the conference immensely. So thank you to all the team involved in putting this on. I've really enjoyed all these different facets of loss that we've been exploring over the last couple of days. And obviously, as we've been exploring, there is a wide range of evidence for the existence of medieval manuscripts that cannot currently be located. Some of those books have been destroyed, but very often what we're looking at is a problem where we have manuscripts that survive today, but we can't identify them, match them with earlier descriptions. And that is often for a range of reasons. Accounts of manuscripts survive from the Middle Ages onwards and are usually records of an encounter between a person or people and books. give just one example, this 12th century list of books from Figmont in Normandy details about 176 items, but it's unclear why it was made, and it's hard to match surviving manuscripts to descriptions such as Bibliotheca in 1 volume, another in 2 volumes. While a book may change its format over the centuries between the Middle Ages and now, for example, being added to or broken up, and we've seen some great examples of that, the people involved in creating descriptions of manuscripts are, I think, much less consistent over that period. The Cultivate Manuscript Project, funded by the European Research Council, is examining accounts of manuscripts created in the context of the international trade in medieval books between 1900 and 1945. It explores what descriptions of manuscripts reveal about the values projected onto books in a period sometimes known as the Golden Age of book collecting, which saw the creation of many important libraries, particularly in America. In that work, as you've just heard, we're partnering with the Schoenberg database of manuscripts, which records observations of manuscripts throughout history. The project's decision to focus on the early 20th century was partly driven by the challenge of the break that occurs after about 3 generations in a sense of connection to a time before our own lifespans, generated by shared memories. As time moves on and we no longer have direct access to or contact with people who were involved in the book trade around the year 1900, or even to those who knew them, it seems to become a more distant historical past. And there's an associated risk that documents connected with that trade are more easily discarded. The choice of time span for the project was also pragmatic, as catalogue descriptions become much fuller in this period. Although not quite as slim as that 12th century description that I showed you a minute ago, this from an 1890 Puttingham Simpson's auction catalogue is equally frustrating. What do we do with the news that lot 922 was a manuscript containing 4 Latin theological treatises written on paper in an old binding from the 14th century? These are the sort of problems that my team find particularly challenging. The issue here is that we've lost the context for which this catalogue was created. In this case, an auction room in which a manuscript could be consulted in order to make sense of the information written here. What my team is doing, however, is conducting a very extensive study of these kinds of records, which then enables us to start filling in some of the gaps in the evidence. For example, tracing the provenance history of manuscripts through sales catalogues and dealers' records suggests that this loss, which hopefully you can see on the left there, we've got something is missing, something has been removed from this flyleaf. And after a bit of detective work, I'm very confident that what should have been here is a version of this book plate, because the book was once owned by Henry White, a wine merchant and collector who died in 1900. And you get bonus points if before today you'd ever heard of Henry White. This is again an example of the kinds of collective knowledge that we don't tend to stress or pass on, things that we choose to forget, even if most of the books still have the book plate and somebody hasn't gone to the trouble of removing it as they have in the one on the left. Why would we bother about this research? Well, once you've worked out that White once owned this book, it's then possible to do analysis to try and understand the book as part of White's collection and to understand the factors that led to its acquisition for its current home, the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And more broadly, to understand how the libraries available to scholars today are the result of previous generations' understanding of and attitudes towards manuscripts. Where things have ended up has been the result of lots and lots of decisions made by different people over time. And in some ways, it's astonishing that anything at all has survived. But we are encountering the Middle Ages through that filtered lens of many generations of collectors. So to try and pick all of this apart, I have a large team. So the full team is me, and I'm working on a book about the manuscript trade in Britain. Danielle Magnuson and Anna Diaz, who are working on America. Hannah Morcos and Federico Botana, who are working on the trade in France and Italy. Angéline Rais, who's working on Germany. Pierre-Louis Pinault, who's examining the role of clubs and societies in the dissemination of ideas about manuscripts. Olivia Baskerville, who's working on national collections in Britain, and Natalia Fantetti, who is working on women and who spoke during yesterday's session. What we're going to do now is hear from just 4 of the team. You may be relieved to hear that we're going to present very short case studies from their research, exploring how they've encountered the issue of loss, whether archival or deliberate whether accidental or deliberate in archival information, provenance history, or historical context. As I think is becoming very apparent, loss is a fundamental problem for all of us who are studying history, but it's one that manifests in different ways in different contexts. Most of our work as historians and manuscript scholars inevitably begins from what has survived, but by changing the emphasis to focus on absences and gaps, we're forced to confront the methods that we're using and the assumptions that we are making in creating our histories. And I think that helps us to see what we're doing from a new perspective. At the end, what we're going to do is hear the four short case studies, and then we'll have lots of time, hopefully at the end, for discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now to hand straight over to Angéline, who hopefully can share her screen and get her slides set up. So Angéline, as I said, is working on Germany, which we define very broadly as countries in which German was spoken in this period. But to narrow down that enormous body of material, she's focusing mainly on the famous Rosenthal booksellers of Munich. And as you can see, she's going to talk to us now about lost owners, the case of Jacques Rosenthal, and Petrarch's manuscripts. So Angéline, I give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you very much. And good morning, everyone. And thank you to the organizers for inviting us. So my talk today will explore how booksellers emphasized or ignored provenance information for commercial purposes. For this case study, I've chosen to examine the dispersal of a group of books claimed to have belonged to Petrarch. I will first briefly outline the history of this collection to demonstrate how its attribution was fabricated. Then I will look at what happened when these manuscripts appeared on the market in the late 19th and 20th centuries to show how dealers included or disregarded ownership evidence. So in 79, Giuseppe Bilanovic, an expert in medieval Italian literature, studied the history of manuscripts that supposedly belonged to Petrarch. He explained that some biographers embellished the accounts of Petrarch's time in the Charterhouse in Garegnano, near Milan, where he stayed periodically between 1353 and 1357. They wrote that instead of living with the monks, Petrarch settled in a house close to the monastery called l'Inferno, Hell, whose name later evolved in L'Interno. In the 17th century, the historian Giacomo Filippo Tomasini expanded this tale in the second edition of his Petrarca Redivivus. Some copies of this work contained a short biography of Petrarch printed by Guillaume Rouillet, as well as a list of 114 manuscripts reputedly housed in Interno. According to Tomasini, Petrarch, when he left the place, gave his books to the Carthusians. In the 19th century, Some of these manuscripts reappeared in the collection of a Milanese engineer, Bernardino Ferrari, who gave them to the Ambrosiana Library in 1930. 33 other items found their way into the library of Duke Carlo Visconti di Modrone, who in 1839 sold or gave them to another engineer, Giuseppe Bruschetti. In 1865, Bruschetti tried unsuccessfully to sell this collection at Milan. Eventually, in 1883, Luigi Arrigoni announced in Notice historique et bibliographique that he owned 24 books formerly belonging to Petrarch. Arrigoni's work was divided into two parts. In the first, he recounted the history of these manuscripts from L'interno to his library. He also explained that in the 16th century, a monk at Gargano, wishing to mark Petrarch's ownership, pasted Rui's account, as well as a book plate with the bishop's mitre and two inscriptions, including Fragmentum Bibliothecae Petrarchae, in the books. The second part of the work consisted of a catalogue of the manuscripts. Bilanovic mentioned that after Arrigoni's death in 1886, the books were sent to the Munich bookseller Rosenthal, who gave two of them to the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek. The rest of the collection appeared in an auction organized by Sotheby's in London in April 1899. This was, however, not quite correct, since both books now in the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek were also included in the Sotheby's catalogue. So let's now examine this auction to understand how dealers organized the dispersal of Petrarch's books. As well as incunables, later printed books and maps, the catalogue contained 104 pre-modern manuscripts, including 23 from the Library of Petrarch. To emphasize their provenance, the books were recorded in a separate section. A short introduction revealed that catalogers had established Petrarch's ownership by comparing notes visible in the manuscripts with his handwriting in a facsimile of his Virgil in the Ambrosiana Library. The contents of Sotheby's catalogue provide additional insights to identify Jacques Rosenthal, not Ludwig or Nathan, his brothers, who were also booksellers at Munich at that time, as the dealer who organized the sale. And I've traced all but one of the 23 lots supposedly belonging to Petrarch in Rosenthal's catalogue, number 17. Here's the title page of the annotated copy of Rosenthal's catalogue, now in the Munich City Archives. Although this inscription suggests that this list was released on the 10th of May 1899, internal evidence demonstrates that it was prepared before the Sotheby's auction. Notes by Rosenthal's employees indicate that some items, such as Ambrosius' commentary on the Pauline epistles, had already been sold in London in April 1899. This is confirmed by Sotheby's annotated catalogue, which reveals that J.A.J. Leighton purchased this lot for £12. In addition to this, the fact that as of now, I've traced 92 out of the 104 manuscripts offered at the Sotheby's auction in 5 of Rosenthal's catalogues issued before the sale, as well as in his catalogues published between 1909 and 1928, clearly indicates that he commissioned Sotheby's to sell some of his books, but also that many of them found no buyer at the auction. Let's now look at how Jacques Rosenthal sold and advertised the manuscripts from Petrarch's invented library to understand why he has remained largely absent from their ownership history, as discussed in Modern Contributions. 4 of the books were acquired at Sotheby's auction by British buyers. In addition to the item purchased by Leighton, a gospel went to Mary Augusta Elton, a Ricardus de Media Villa to Marx, and a Bible to Quaritch. In the following years, Rosenthal did not gather the remaining books in one catalogue, but offer some of them in his catalogues 42 and 83, issued in 1906 and 1925. In doing so, he managed to sell some manuscripts on various occasions until the mid-1930s. According to the annotated catalogue, in November 1900, a London dealer, Thomas Tune, bought an item. In 1907, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France obtained a theological treatise, and in 1919, the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek purchased a commentary on Lombard's works. In 1922, Rosenthal forwarded 2 items to the Einkaufsgesellschaft Leuven, an association of German dealers who supplied books to the Leuven University Library destroyed in 1914. In April 1927, Leo Olschky bought 4 manuscripts, and Ulrich Höckli another one in 1934. Although the subsequent history of 6 manuscripts remains unclear, the firm which carried out Rosenthal's business after the Second World War sold 1 book to the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek in 1946, and Jacques' grandson, Barney Rosenthal, obtained 1 last item, which he included in his list 17 in 1960. This account indicates that none of these buyers acquired these manuscripts before because of their association with Petrarch. If that had been the case, someone would have probably bought them en bloc. Furthermore, the fact that Rosenthal did not describe these books as a group and did not include a heading relating to Petrarch or an introduction, such as in Arrigoni's work or Sotheby's catalogue, demonstrate that they did not regard Petrarch's ownership as a valid commercial asset. Although he occasionally recorded the presence of Rouillet's work, the bookplate, as well as the annotations supposedly in Petrarch's hand, Rosenthal chose his words carefully to describe these items. He wrote, "At the beginning, someone added a 17th century bookplate assigning this book to Petrarch's ownership, as well as a 2-page biography, and a beautifully, carefully written and neatly rubricated manuscript of the most important work, particularly interested because it has been viewed as formerly being in Petrarch's library." It then went on explaining that the volume came from the Charterhouse, where it received the printed leaves and the bookplate in the 16th century. It is also important to note that, unlike Arrigoni and Sotheby's catalogers, Rosenthal did not claim that all these books came from Petrarch's library. He only mentioned material evidence of Petrarch's invented ownership he could see in the books, as he usually did in his descriptions of provenance information. And here, the slide shows you material evidence, an description, and how Rosenthal described it in a catalogue. So the way Rosenthal distributed these manuscripts in several catalogues and his caution descriptive records suggest that he may well have doubted claims made about these books' illustrious previous owner. The fact that from the late 1860s onwards, scholars started to question the authenticity of Petrarch's library of L'Interno certainly played a role in how Rosenthal marketed these books. By omitting Petrarch's name in the title of his catalogues, and by not assigning all these books to Petrarch's library, Rosenthal concealed provenance information for commercial purposes. This case study also shows that offering items at auction and through fixed-priced catalogues were different methods of selling books. While items described in the sale catalogue could be purchased over a long period of time, an auction consisted of a unique occasion for a dealer to promote his stock, and to attract buyers, he needed a highlight. It is for this reason that Rosenthal and Sotheby's catalogers included Petrarch's name in the title of the auction catalog and recorded his books in a separate section. As well as demonstrating that ownership evidence was disregarded or emphasized for commercial purposes, this account has indicated that the name of dealers got intentionally lost at public auctions. In fact, Rosenthal was not mentioned as the individual who commissioned Sotheby's to sell his books in the auction catalog or in British press article reporting the sales results, such as in these two. This loss of information has hidden an essential part of these manuscripts' ownership history, that is their presence in Rosenthal stock. By doing so, this has concealed the contribution of a German bookseller to the London market and international connections in the antiquarian book trade at the turn of the century. Finally, it is important to note that while Petrarch's name was used as a commercial asset, Rosenthal's has been forgotten because the importance of booksellers in manuscript history, although influential as these case studies have shown, has not always been fully appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angéline. For those of you who've arrived while that's in progress, just to explain, we're going to keep all the questions to the end. If you have questions, feel free to post them in the chat. Some people have already started sending me questions, which is great, but we're going to just move straight on. Thanking Angéline very much for that insight into the way in which booksellers have tacitly shaped so much of the collections that we now experience on multiple levels. I'm going to ask Pierre-Louis to share your screen, and we will move on to something slightly different. So Pierre-Louis Pinault is a PhD student with the project, and he is working on the roles of clubs and societies in transmitting knowledge about the book trade. And he is going to talk to us about a case study today, and I'm going to mangle the French, which is going to be embarrassing, but j'avais à peu près perdu tout espoir de retrouver ce manuscrit fantôme, lost medieval manuscript provenances discovered by Comte Paul Durieux at the 1908 Burlington Fine Arts Club exhibition. So, Pierre-Louis, I give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I hope you can hear me and see my slides. Perfect. So my case study will briefly evoke Comte Paul Durieux's scholarship on lost medieval manuscript provenance, fostered by the 1908 Burlington Fine Arts Club exhibition. This exhibition is often mentioned in sections dedicated to provenance history in sale catalogs entries. Thanks to his wide social network, this renowned French art historian got special access to the manuscripts on display at the 1908 Burlington Fine Arts Club exhibition, although he was not a member of the club himself. Durieux identified the provenance of at least 2 manuscripts in this exhibition. Before starting this paper, I have to give credits to the previous works of Laura Cleaver and William Stoneman on the 1908 Burlington Fine Arts Club exhibition, and to Nathalie Roman for a recent work on Durieux's scholarship on painted manuscripts. And I will first present Paul Durieux, then talk about the 1908 Burlington Fine Arts Club exhibition, and then I will finish with the 2 provenance identification that Durieux made. After graduating first in the 1878 class of the École des Chartes, Paul Durieux went to the École Française de Rome. Then he took a turn in his career. He was appointed an assistant curator at the Department of Paintings of the Louvre in 1881, and he held this position for almost 20 years. He was primarily interested in the diplomatic relations between France and Italy in the Middle Ages. Then he came to specialize in medieval and Renaissance illuminated manuscripts, more particularly in late 15th and early 16th century books of hours and miniatures. Durieux was elected at the Académie des Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres in 1907. Then he was elected to the Société des Bibliophiles François in 1909, so the oldest French Society of Bibliophiles and the second oldest after the Roxburgh Club. Durieux was an unflaggingly active publisher in bulletins and journals of numerous bibliophilic clubs and learned societies. He, however, mainly focused on iconographic and art history aspects, and he would but scarcely analyze medieval manuscripts provenance. The Burlington Fine Arts Club dates back to informal meetings held as soon as 1856, but it was officially founded in London in 1866. Then it was dissolved in 1952. As its name suggests, labeling it solely as a bibliophilic club would be insufficient. It was created originally by rich Victorian amateurs as a collectors' club because a wide array of artworks was covered by its centers of interest. After two exhibitions of illuminated manuscripts held in 1874 and 1886, the Burlington Fine Arts Club organized a larger scale exhibition on the same topic in 1908. It was chiefly curated by Sidney Cockrell, who wrote the introduction of the large in-folio catalog that you can see the cover here. The other members of the committee of the exhibition were Lord Balcarres, Emer James, Falconer Madan, Charles Dyson Perrins, Henriette Thompson, and George Warner. In the introduction of the catalog, Cockrell refers to manuscripts as interesting toys. This phrase tells something of the value projected onto pre-modern manuscripts by a scholar like Cockrell. Erudite knowledge almost meets entertainment here. In the premises used for the exhibition, the manuscripts were organized by schools and displayed in 18 cases. Major lenders, most of whom were fellow members of the Philobibelon Society, the Burlington Fine Arts Club, and the Roxburgh Club, included Lord Aldenham, G.L. Alford, A.H. Huth, J.P. Morgan, Charles Dyson Perrins, and Henriette Thompson. The first manuscripts that was discovered at, the first medieval manuscript provenance that was discovered at the 1908 Burlington Fine Arts Club exhibition is for this item. The 1908 Burlington Fine Arts Club exhibition and its catalogue were tantalizing resources for scholars in medieval manuscript studies. Cockrell and Yates Thompson granted Paul Durieux special permission to consult this manuscript on display. It was a courtesy of the Duke of Devonshire. Paul Durieux ascertains that this 15th century Flemish manuscript of the Vengeance de Notre Seigneur Jésus-Christ came from the library of the Dukes of Burgundy. He published the results of his research in the 1910 issue of the Bibliothèque de l'École des Chartes, and his article was entitled Découverte de deux importants manuscrits de la librairie des Ducs de Bourgogne. In this article, Durieux talks about this manuscript as a manuscrit fantôme, a ghost manuscript. Indeed, Durieux claimed to have been looking for this manuscript for many years. He had hypothesized its existence on the basis of his work on records of the library of the Dukes of Burgundy. Durieux inspected the two volumes and he compared them with the description of a volume contained in the 1468 inventory of the library of the Dukes of Burgundy. The number of quires, the beginning and the end of the text matched. This volume was copied by Yvonnet Le Jeune and illuminated by Loisel-Liédé, and it is now London, British Library, additional manuscripts 89066, 1 and 2, because it is still in 2 volumes. The second manuscripts, medieval manuscript provenance discovered by Durieux is this item of the 1908 catalogue. In 1911, Durieux revealed that the exhibition had helped him to identify a previously little-known 16th century manuscript of the statutes of the Order of St. Michael. In the exhibition, it was a courtesy of Sir George Alford. Relying on the evidence of a man's portrait painted in the manuscript and comparing it with another contemporary craftwork, Durieux asserted that it had been gifted to Edward VI by the Kingdom of France. Durieux published the results of his research in the Compte rendu des séances de l'Académie des Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres in 1911. This manuscript was last seen at the 1933 Beatty sale at Sotheby's. And here is the plates of this manuscript featured in the 1908 Burlington Fine Arts Club catalog. So the current location of this manuscript is unknown, therefore it can be deemed lost again. Of the two pre-modern manuscripts identified by Durieux at the 1908 Burlington Fine Arts Club exhibition, this now is the Manuscrit Fantôme, or ghost manuscript. Thus, the 1908 exhibition enabled a fruitful transnational cooperation between members of bibliophilic clubs and learned societies. A man of numerous international scholarly acquaintances, Durieux was used to traveling extensively across Europe for his research. He appears to have been one of the very few lucky French scholars to visit the 1908 exhibition, hence his practically unrivaled exclusivity in producing erudite works based on the manuscripts he had the privilege to examine there. He could then easily have his findings published by the clubs and societies of which he was a member. For Durieux, the identification of the lost provenance of these pre-modern manuscripts served greater purposes. For the manuscript from the Library of the Dukes of Burgundy, it was a way to complete his panorama of the iconographic tradition of the Burgundian artist Loisel-Liédé. This discovery helped Durieux concluding a 20-year-long art history investigation. And I will conclude by quoting Janet Backhouse, quote, "The Burlington Fine Arts Club exhibition publicly reflected a very remarkable degree of ongoing collaboration between the leading manuscript scholars of the day and the small group of wealthy private collectors, particularly active at the time." Unquote. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pierre-Louis. One of the rules of giving these kinds of papers is that as soon as we declare that we don't know where something is, somebody else is able to tell us. So if you know where that manuscript is, or if you have any clues, please do share those with us at the end when we get to the question and answer time. We're going to move on to the third of our 4 case studies now, which will be Olivia Baskerville. So Olivia, if you want to start sharing your screen, that would be great. Olivia is another doctoral student with the project. She is researching ideas about nationalism and rhetoric, something that we see a lot of in this period, but which manifests in very different ways. And she's going to talk, as you can see from the screen, about this idea of books being lost for the nation, British Museum acquisitions and the rhetoric of loss. So Olivia, when you are ready, I give you the floor. Thank you.
Hello, apologies, can everybody hear me all right? Thank you, Laura, very much. And thank you to Lynn and to the rest of the Schoenberg Institute team for the invitation to speak to everybody today. In 1920, Julius Gilson of the Department of Manuscripts at the British Museum wrote to the Committee of the National Art Collections Fund to request financial assistance with the purchase of 1 manuscript at the upcoming sale of Henry Yates Thompson's famous collection. It seems to us the one by the purchase of which the museum stands to gain the most, and by the loss of which from the country we stand to lose the most. I'll return in a few minutes to the manuscript in question, but I want to focus in particular on the rhetoric of loss in this passage from Gilson's letter, and in other correspondence and discourse regarding the acquisition of manuscripts for the British Museum. Those of us looking at the international book trade in the first half of the 20th century are used to coming across the phrase "saved for the nation" splashed across the press coverage of prominent sales. But Gilson's letter inverts this rhetoric, suggesting that for the manuscript to physically leave the country would represent a loss of something meaningful from within the geographic borders of the English nation. Today, I want to explore briefly how ubiquitous the rhetoric of loss was in regard to manuscripts which were not acquired by the British Museum, as well as those which were. Who was declaring which manuscripts to be lost, and in what circumstances? Which manuscripts were lost to the nation and which were simply not acquired? In 1917, the Liverpool Daily Post lamented the sale of the Bridgewater Library, the property of the Earls of Ellesmere, steadily accumulated since the 17th century. That its contents, including an illuminated copy of the Canterbury Tales, should have left England or its ancient habitat. This is now the famous Ellesmere Chaucer in the Huntington Library. 2 years later, the drama scholar Frederick Boas surveyed the recent sales of aristocratic libraries and decried the loss of the manuscript as an important textual authority for English literature. It is to be deplored that owing to the present day circumstances, many of these irreplaceable treasures are rapidly leaving this country, said Boas. Unless some public action is soon taken, our losses, already heavy, will become increasingly severe. But the press was not united on this matter. Clement King Shorter, a Fleet Street editor and literary enthusiast, opined in his pet literary letter in The Sphere that "I have no sympathy with the occasional outcry when our valuable books or art treasures go to America." And as regarded the Ellesmere copy of Chaucer, it may have been the most treasured book in the Bridgewater Library, but happily for scholars, facsimiles are still available in this country. A survey of the press regarding the Bridgewater Library does not immediately reveal whatever outcry Shorter may have been referring to. The Liverpool Daily Post's comment aside, the newspapers were fairly sanguine about the sale. The Times gave a brief history of the collection's ownership, without comment regarding its dispersal, except that it had been purchased by George D. Smith on behalf of Henry Huntington, and most other papers syndicated the Times announcement. I have not yet found any evidence that the museum attempted to acquire the British Museum attempted to acquire the Bridgewater Library, or even just the Ellesmere Chaucer. Instead, the museum was quietly getting on with expanding its manuscript collections as best it could, at the London Book Auction with very little press attention. We can see this activity represented in the commissions which Gilson and his department sent to their agent, Bernard Quaritch Limited, and for which Quaritch bid on their behalf. Part of the value of the firm's commission books is that they record not only the bids which the museum won, but also those those in which they were outbid. If Boas and the Liverpool Daily Post could consider a book the museum never tried to acquire to be a national loss, how are these everyday losses at auction to be treated? Did losses at auction constitute national losses? Between 1917 and 1920, the British Museum Department of Manuscripts, headed by Gilson, bid on 80 lots at auction from manuscripts dated before 1500. And of those 80, they did not acquire 54, or about 2/3 of the total. The bids, both won and lost, represent a hodgepodge of types, time periods, and provenances of written document. They range from illuminated psalters and missals from across Europe, to bundles of abbey charters and court rolls, to a 15th century Dante, and a French prose account of the Legend of the Black Prince, which is now Senate House Library MS1. In some cases, the museum was superseded by book dealers, sometimes private collectors, and not that rarely, even by their own agent Quaritch, who, for example, purchased a bundle of letters of one Sir John Fastolf for £190 more than the museum authorities were prepared to pay, and then sold it on to the museum for cost price plus commission. The lot of Fastolf letters, for which the museum bid £500, represented a particular effort for the Department of Manuscripts. Few of the bids they were prepared to make went above £100, and only the bid made on a 15th century copy of Dante's Divina Commedia at the Lord Vernon sale in 1918 represented a similar potential drain on the museum's funds at £385. To put these failed bids in a financial context, in 1917 and 1918, the Department of Manuscripts' purchase budget had been entirely suspended due to the war. In 1919 and 1920, it was reinstated at £1,500, the same as it had been before the war, and indeed the same as it had been since before the turn of the century. The attempt for the Fastolf letters in the 1919 Phillips sale therefore represented 1/3 of the department's entire purchase grant for that year, and the final purchase price of £690 was a considerably higher proportion. The size of the purchase grant may explain the museum's tendency to make low bids. At the same sale of Lord Vernon's library, a £65 bid on a 13th century Greek New Testament lost out to Maggs Brothers at £255, and a £100 bid on an Italian copy of the works of Virgil was quickly lost to Yates Thompson for £710. It may also explain the museum's tendency to bid for cheap items. For a bundle of 10 14th century charters relating to Bordeaux, the museum bid £1 5s and lost out at £3. Similarly, for a handful of lots of deeds relating to the Abbey of Fountains in Lord Mostyn's sale, the museum bid between £5 and £10 and lost most of them for only £1 or £2 more. For the vast majority of these lost bids, I have found nothing more about them in the record, although the British Museum acquisitions records may have more to say about the staff's approach to auction acquisitions. But then, if losses to the museum at auction were not worthy of significant attention and outcry, which pre-modern manuscripts then constituted a national loss? Under what circumstances did Shorter's outcry appear, and what form did it take? We can begin to get an idea by looking at the sale of the Henry Yates Thompson collection in 1919 and 1920. Yates Thompson's collection had been formulated with significant assistance from Cambridge scholar M.R. James and his successor as director of the Fitzwilliam Museum, Sidney Cockerell. When Yates Thompson declared his intention to sell his collection in 1918, James and Cockerell both wrote to Yates Thompson in shock. James, a trustee of the British Museum, was explicit about his preconceptions of the collection's final resting place. I did think they were at least safe for England and were not once gathered to be dispersed again. Do perpetuate your name, not by a sensational sale and by prices fetched, but by a treasure of beauty and history laid up for the generations to come. That other is a fleeting thing, this a real permanent service to the nation and the race. The meaning and value of it will grow as the years roll on. Faced with Yates Thompson's resolve to sell, James identified degrees of importance within the collection. 8 manuscripts, as far as James' work was concerned, were of particular meaning and value to the nation and the race. Is the museum always to lack its other half of the Somme Leroy and its French Bible? Are the Talbot books to leave England again, and the Caro Psalter, and the Tameth Hours, and the Sister of the Lambeth Apocalypse, and the Saint Omer? James insisted that the museum was the only place for these books in the service of scholarship and of artistic appreciation. Yates Thompson's refusal to donate the collection was a significant loss to scholars as far as James was concerned, and the museum going public. But Yates Thompson's response is of firm disagreement. After some little experience and much consideration, I don't want to see mine merged in any public institution. How great, said Yates Thompson. To myself, and doubtless to others, the possession of one of them gave greater delight than the glimpses of even finer specimens by the courteous permission of any librarian of any public library. Nonetheless, he relented and donated one of those identified by James to the museum, the St. Omer Psalter, in appreciation of Warner and James's assistance with his catalogs. It is now Yates Thompson MS 14. But what happened to the rest? Of those listed by James, the British Museum Department of Manuscripts seems only to have agreed regarding one, the other half of the Somme Loire, or a manuscript known by Yates Thompson as the Saint-Abbé. For this manuscript, the trustees, including and presumably prompted by James, granted £5,000 from the museum's reserve fund. It's now Yates Thompson MS 11. That £5,000 represents over 3 times the department's annual purchase grant. It was a near thing though. Quaritch received the museum's instructions only half an hour before the sale in a hastily scrawled note from Gilson, which indicated that if the bid for the Saint-Abbé failed, Quaritch should try for a 12th century martyrology from Monte Cassino, or a 14th century Italian pontifical, or a 15th century Florentine volume of mainly unilluminated texts. None of these final 3 were in James's original list of priorities, even though the Talbot Hours and the Hours of Margaret of Beauchamp, 2 which he had identified, were up at the same sale and sold for significantly less than the museum's budget. Both of these went to one Thomas Henry Riche. Further evidence that the museum's directors were willing to lose some of the manuscripts identified by James, but not to lose others identified by themselves, came during Yates Thompson's second sale in 1920, when Gilson wrote to the National Art Collections Fund requesting financial assistance. In 1903, the fund had been set up as a membership body in response to a perceived continuous drain on works of art from England. The loss, declared the fund's secretary, was twofold. Not only were public galleries and museums unable to purchase much of the treasure flooding onto the market, but in their stead, foreign purchasers were taking the artworks abroad. His concerns here echo closely James's fears for Yates Thompson's collection. As far as the fund and its membership of middle-class art lovers and arts professionals were concerned, certain works of art belonged in England's public galleries, and failing that, at least in an English private collection. Their absence was a significant loss. In 1919, Frederick Boas' call to stem the perceived tide of aristocratic libraries proposed the formation of a permanent committee, analogous to that which administers the National Art Collections Fund, to secure for the nation books that would otherwise go overseas. Such a committee wasn't created, but a year later, the fund was willing to help the British Museum secure books where it had not been willing to do so previously. Gilson's letter to the National Art Collections Fund identified 4 manuscripts of potential interest to the department: the Psalter of John of Gaunt, the 13th century Salvin Hours, the 12th century Life of St. Cuthbert made in Durham, and an Italian Psalter from Padua. These, Gilson explained, were best placed to fill the gaps in our collections. Not one of them had been identified by James in his letter to Yates Thompson. When pressed to narrow down his selection, Gilson requested assistance only for the Durham Life of St. Cuthbert. It is at this point that he indicated that this was the one manuscript by the purchase of which the museum stands to gain the most, and by the loss of which from the country we stand to lose the most. The fund, in apparent agreement, delivered £1,000 to the museum. A handful of its members provided £2,000, and the museum trustees provided the balance of £2,000. In the same sale, James's priorities, the Sister of the Lambeth Apocalypse and the Caro Psalter, sold to Gulbenkian and Henry Waters in America. Of the rest of James's identified priorities, the Tameth Hours had been given to Yates Thompson's wife, Elizabeth Smith, in 1917. The French Bible was bought in at the 1921 sale and left to Elizabeth upon his death. She bequeathed some of her manuscripts to the British Museum in 1929 and the rest in 1941. So while the museum did eventually acquire 6 of the 8 volumes identified by James as national treasures, it was not through their own impetus at the Yates-Thompson sales. The staff at the Department of Manuscripts had different priorities to their illustrious and knowledgeable trustee James, priorities which they executed mainly in the auction room on a budget which could not compete at the high end of the market, but was functional for modest, regular acquisitions. When items of high value did come onto the market, the museum staff depended on the judgment, influence, and financial means of the trustees or of external sources. In appealing to trustees like James and to the members of the National Art Collections Fund, Gilson and his staff deferred to their priorities for national monuments or adopted the rhetoric of national loss to plead their case. The rhetoric of loss as a tool for deciding national priorities regarding manuscripts at the British Museum was therefore directed primarily by middle-class arts professionals and scholars, such as Boas, James, and Witt, and not the staff of the British Museum.
Thank you very much, Olivia. That I think will raise lots of questions. So again, if people have questions, post them in the chat or just remember them for the Q&A, because we have one more paper to hear. Last but not least, I'm going to invite Federico Botana to share his screen. Federico, if you can do that. Federico is a postdoctoral researcher with the project allied to the strand on France, but working mostly on relationships between France and Italy and the place of Italy and France in the international trade. And he's going to talk now about lost words, Tamaro de Marinis and Orion, April to July 1909. So Federico, I give you the microphone.
Thank you, Laura. Can you hear me well? Okay, great. So my little case study is about a set of 9 letters we kept in the Archives Modernes of the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. They were written during the spring and the summer of 1909 by the Italian book dealer Tamaro de Marinis to Henri Aumont, then curator of manuscripts at the library. Their object was to convince Aumont to buy a manuscript inventory of the possessions of King Ferdinand I of Naples, drafted in 1481. Excuse me 1 second. As I shall reveal, de Marinis' letters shed light on his cunning negotiating tactics, but most importantly for us today, they provide an example of how the loss of recent documents can impact on our research. Aumont's replies cannot be found amongst the remains of de Marinis' personal archive, nor have copies been preserved by the Bibliothèque Nationale. Nonetheless, as I shall demonstrate, we can get a good idea of Aumont's responses from de Marinis' letters, which suggests that Aumont skillfully maneuvered the negotiations to the advantage of the Bibliothèque. Henri Aumont was born in Normandy in 1857. In 1877, he entered the École des Chartes, and in 1882, the Bibliothèque Nationale, where he was appointed curator of manuscripts in 1899. As a scholar, his contribution to the study of medieval paleography was significant, yet he's mostly remembered for having catalogued and described thousands of manuscripts. Tamaro de Marinis was born in Naples in 1878. At 18, he was employed by an antiquarian bookshop in Naples, the Libreria Antiquaria Margheri, and in 1900, he was engaged by Leo Olszki to work for his firm in Florence, where in 1905, he established his own business. He retired as a book dealer in 1924 after selling his stock to Ulrico Höppli, for 4 million lire, then roughly the equivalent of 40,000 pounds. De Marinis was not only an astute businessman, he was also a scholar. His main passion was the library of the Aragon kings of Naples in the 15th century. His research on the subject, which he began as a teenager, culminated in the publication of a 6-volume catalogue of the Royal Library, itself an enterprise of several decades. The first volume appeared in 1947 and the last in 1969, year of his death. He built on the work of scholars of previous generations, especially Leopold de Lille and Giuseppe Mazzatinti, but also on sources he himself discovered, notably the manuscript he sold to Aumont, which became known as Inventory A. The first letter written by de Marinis to Aumont on the subject of the inventory is dated 1st of April 1909. De Marinis refers here to the inventory as un document de la plus haute importance pour l'histoire de la Bibliothèque du Roi d'Aragon, a document of the highest importance for the history of the Library of the King of Aragon. The inventory, comprising 6 paper folios, lists the items pawned in 1481 by Ferdinand I to the Florentine banker Battista Pandolfini in exchange for 38,000 gold ducats. Ferdinand was in urgent need of money to recapture the city of Otranto in Puglia, which had been taken by Ottoman forces in 1480. Amongst the items listed in the inventory, we discover Ferdinand's gold crown with 6 rubies, 6 diamonds, and 108 pearls, and 266 books. About 200 of these books were manuscripts, and the rest were printed. Ferdinand's library included a splendid manuscripts. For example, this Dante, illustrated by Priamo della Quercia and Giovanni di Paolo, and of course, lavish humanistic manuscripts, like the Plutarch and the Lactantius we now see on the screen. In the first letter, de Marinis informs Aumont that the present owner of inventory would rather be paid with a rare Italian incunabulum instead of receiving money. He then tells him, if you could offer an important duplicate, the library will rapidly obtain the precious document. Exchanges involving incunabula between collectors and dealers were probably commonplace. For instance, in 1907, Leo Olszki and J.P. Morgan exchanged 2 different editions of the Constitutiones by Clement V as part of a debt settlement. We know of instances in which public institutions sold duplicate incunabula. It happened in the British Museum. However, such transactions seem highly unlikely at the Bibliothèque Nationale, since in French law, the patrimony of the state was inalienable, and duplicate books usually were, and still are, sent to provincial libraries. Aumont, most likely, did not reply to de Marinis, because de Marinis wrote again on the 22nd of April to inform Aumont that he had also obtained the document written by the secretary of King Ferdinand when the jewels and the books were returned by Pandolfini in 1482. I find difficult to believe that this document, just a leaf of paper, suddenly appeared at this opportune moment, and that it was not already enclosed within the manuscript. I'm inclined to think that de Marinis decided to mention the document at this moment to obtain a response from Aumont. De Marinis insists in this letter that the owner wants a very rare Italian book from around 1500, but he neither gives a title nor an edition. He concludes with nous attendons des propositions, so he was expecting Aumont to make a proposal. If Aumont replied this time, he did not do it right away. On the 10th of May, de Marinis wrote again to inform him that the owner of the inventory wanted Virgil's Eclogues in the 1501 edition printed by Aldus Manutius, and the 4th volume of Aristotle's works, also by Manutius. Indeed, 2 very valuable books. From the Marinis' next letter, dated 25th of May, one can deduce that the Bibliothèque Nationale could not or would not procure the Virgil. So the Marini sent a list of alternatives, apparently proposed by the owner of the inventory. In the following letter, dated 7th of June, we learned that Aumont replied on the 4th, but did not offer any book as a payment, since the Marinis then declares, "Nous regrettons devoir vous dire qu'il ne veut pas avoir de l'argent, mais il désire que vous-même proposiez les documents disponibles. Il préfère les livres à figures italiennes, les incunables très rares." So he insists that the owner, if he really existed, does not want any money, and tries to convince Aumont to send him a list of the library's most valuable duplicated Italian incunabula with woodcuts. The Marinis' request seems rather unorthodox, perhaps even devious. In fact, he was trying to obtain information that was not yet publicly available. Since the third volume of the Catalogue of Incunabula in the French libraries by Marie Pélechet, published in 1909, finished in the letter G. From the Marinis' next letter, dated 22nd of June, it appears that Aumont had not yet made an offer that would satisfy him. So he now tries to put pressure on him. The owner is about to leave for the countryside and expects an immediate reply. Here, for the first time, the Marinis signals that he might concede. The owner would accept money since he cannot get the incunabula he wishes, but it is up to Aumont to make an offer. Once again, Aumont did probably not reply, since on the 26th of June, the Marinis wrote again to communicate that the owner wants 2,000 francs, which would amount to a total of 2,200 francs with the Marinis' 10% commission. The Marinis, however, was not going to get 2,200 francs. Somebody, probably Aumont himself, wrote in pencil on the letter, "Offer 1,000 to M." In the following letter, dated July the 5th, the Marinis announces that the owner would accept 1,000 francs, but he still wants a nice book. In the last letter, written on the 12th of July, the Marinis tells Aumont that the owner has finally accepted the offer of 1,000 francs. But he also declares, "We are willing to renounce our commission in the hope that in a future negotiation, you will find a way of compensating us," and requests to be paid immediately. In the Register of Acquisitions of the Bibliothèque Nationale, we discovered that the payment was authorized on the 27th of July for a total of 1,020 francs, which included the fee of the Parisian book dealer Ernest Leroux, who acted as an intermediary since the library did not pay foreign suppliers directly. No mention at all is made of an incunabulum as part of the payment. So we can presume that Aumont prevailed over crafty de Marinis. But on one aspect, we can be sure that the Marinis and Aumont benefited in equal measure. They both published the inventory in 1909. Aumont in the Bibliothèque de l'École des Chartes, the Marinis in a booklet printed in Florence. So each could claim the discovery in his own sphere of influence. Besides their anecdotal charm, the Marinis' letters to Aumont provide an example of fragmentary echoes of a business discussion, as we encounter many times when conducting research on the modern book trade. In this case, the surviving half of the correspondence allows us to deduce the possible twists and turns of the negotiations. But in many other instances, the documentation is too scant to allow us to reach a conclusion. Like in older times, wars and natural catastrophes caused the destructions of masses of documents. The archive of Ulrico Höpli in Milan, for example, was destroyed in 1942 by Allied bombing, and the administrative archives of the Biblioteca Nazionale in Florence suffered irreparable damage during the 1966 flood. Nonetheless, there is an important difference. We are looking at a nearer past, so it is easier to establish when loss might be the result of a human decision. The remains of de Marinis's personal archive constitute a fascinating case. Divided between the Archivio di Stato and the Gabinetto of Viesseux in Florence, they contain virtually no business correspondence, but abound in letters by famous people. Selective survival is in itself a significant fact in the history of 20th century book trade, and one that 21st century scholarship needs to be aware of. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Federico, and thank you to the whole team. So that concludes 4 aspects of what our team has been working on. Unfortunately, we've lost Pierre-Louis in the process of all of that, but the rest of us now are happy to take questions. And I'm going to hand over to Lynn, who's going to chair that, although I think we are giving the first question to Mitch, if you are still with us. Yes.
Thanks.
I think it's a question really for Angéline.
Yeah, this was for Angéline and probably the whole team too, because I was thinking of what the phenomenon, the sort of understudied phenomena of the way stock moves from individual dealers through the auction trade. And I think a lot of people don't realize how many lots at given Sotheby's sales or others come in large groups from dealers. Do you have a sense from the literature of the trade or from correspondence at the time what expected goods sales in the London rooms would be? Is it like a 70% sales, 50%? I think now they really want pretty high percentage of the lots to sell, and it's embarrassing if there's huge numbers not sold. But my sense is that it used to be, through the use of like sort of fake buyer names and other things, that auction houses could conceal that in a large part the sale didn't really go very well. Is there much sort of reflection on what the anticipated results are?
Yes, thank you very much, Mitch, for that question. I'm sorry, just a second.
Mhm.
Mute, s'il te plaît.
Oh, mute, sorry.
Sorry about that. We're in the same room, that's why I wanted to avoid echo. So what I can tell about this sale is that we have the annotated copy of the auction, and from what I can tell, about a quarter of the manuscripts were sold. So I thought first that was not a lot, and I didn't really understand why Rosenthal would do in such a long process in bringing the books to London, have them cataloged and so on. But then I realized that all the code names given for buyers in the catalogs actually were him through Quaritch commission books, because Quaritch received commissioned and then certain limits. And I found out that the limits that buyers give them were also always lower than what Rosenthal was expecting the books to go. So in the end, I think that he was controlling how the price of which the books he could sell. So I think that even if it seems to be like a failed attempt, in the end he controlled and he knew what he wanted to sell. And I mean, he was patient. He spent a lot of time selling the books and so on. So yeah, I think the percentage is not too high, but it was not a failure in the end.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? I'm looking for hands raised. I don't see any.
I could very briefly chip in to answer
Yeah.
Mitch with another example, just in case other people are thinking through questions. It's not something I've looked into extensively, but simply that not everything that Henry Yates Thompson put on the market sold for the price that he was looking for. And I don't know how necessarily embarrassing that was for him at the time. Christopher de Hamel has done some work on this to kind of demonstrate the extent to which Yates Thompson was interested in commercial success and something of a profit in his sales. And if I remember correctly, if he made a profit, it was not a huge one. Laura might have the details on that more than I do, but certainly not all of them sold at the prices he was looking for, and he bought them in and left them to his wife. So it certainly happened that, yeah, plenty of stuff didn't sell.
I have something of a conversational question. Collectively, I mean, you all have brought up some very interesting and very insightful elements of how manuscripts were bought and sold and traded and that sort of thing. But I'm wondering, like, as a group, like what, and looking at all these broad sort of categories, French, German, Italian, what would you say as a group has been the most sort of surprising conclusion that you've reached so far in this project? That's sort of for everyone, but so whoever wants to jump in. Are there any sort of like constant things that you find across these different sectors?
Who wants to start? This is Federico, go on. Yeah.
Well, in many ways, the way they operate, the way the book dealers operated was quite similar, I think, everywhere. I think the English have a particular, well, I think they all had different things, they all different foibles in a way. And there were different administrative details. Like, for example, commissions books, we were talking about that yesterday, like quarries. I don't think they exist anywhere else, but at the same time, there were not as many options as there were here. Things like the Bibliothèque Nationale that couldn't pay for it, book dealers directly, so they have to go through an intermediary. Again, that probably didn't happen in other places. As to collectors, that's where I think where we find the most common things. Like, for example, people who are extremely dedicated to their city, to their local history. Then the industrialists who want to show off, of course, who are in a process of social ascension and they want to emulate the rich of the past. So I think there's sort of patterns which we find everywhere. I think for me, the most surprising things were probably the tricks of things like what I talked today about, those tricks that you wouldn't expect dealers at that level to be practicing on their clients. I think it's quite, that was one of the most surprising things.
Yeah.
I don't know for the rest, but I think, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've been surprised by quite a few things, but the cases that buck the trends are always interesting. So I think I started working on this with the idea that this is the time period that sees a few manuscripts get really celebrated and written about, and that those have come to have a disproportionate place in subsequent scholarship. So things that get sold at sales like the Yates Thompson sale that Olivia talked about, or things that get to be in the 1908 Burlington exhibition that Pierre-Louis talked about, become famous, start to be written about, and then things snowball from there. So the cases that always surprise me are the ones that go in the opposite direction. And if Anna Diaz is still here, she's been working on this fantastic book, The Golden Gospels, an early medieval book on purple parchment with gold text, which soars to the top of the market and has a relatively brief moment of fame in the late 19th century and ends up in Morgan's library and then kind of vanishes from the scene, and actually is very little written about after that, and to the extent that there aren't even photographs of it on the Morgan's website anymore. So the ones that do that always are interesting. The ones that kind of really underline the bigger trends and show just how much this all depends on what people are thinking and feeling and valuing at different times.
We can continue with this later, but EC Schroeder has a question, which I'll read out, but EC, you can join in. He's intrigued by the concept of for the good of the nation. Are there examples of items that were desired for the nation that were later on the list to be saved? Also, were there different national views of what needs to be saved?
Yeah, I would say I missed, it was actually things that were on the list originally, but then actually went off the list, if you will. So like it reflects changes in collecting or what was seen as important. because it was intriguing, the list that you were, someone was rattling off. A couple of them I recognize as coming back around, but others are like, that was a moment and now we don't care. Maybe not don't care, that's a little strong, are less interested.
That's really interesting. I'd love to know which of the list you're thinking of that we're less interested in now, and which kind of seem to have come back around. I think, you know, in some ways the answer to your question is that there actually weren't lists all that often. And the fact that, you know, you say, oh, you're intrigued by this list, like that list is one of the only ones that I've been able to find. And it's interesting that it's created by James, who is a manuscript scholar at Cambridge and a trustee of the British Museum, and not necessarily an employee of the museum or what have you. I have not actually made it to the British Museum acquisition records the way I would like to. So there's a chance that there are more lists, as it were. But to answer your immediate question, I don't know of any that are kind of put on a list and then come off, as it were. That said, the fact that you're saying you recognize some of them, as in they've kind of quote unquote come back around, and some have kind of disappeared into the ether. I'd love to know which ones, because the question is that because they have made their way into the library, because they were acquired by a public national library, or are they the, you know, or is it, and the others have just kind of gone off to private collections? I'm trying to think which one. So the Caro Salter goes to Walters.
Yeah, the Durham, that's probably the most recent and most famous, and that was partly, it was on deposit, so it wasn't really like, it hadn't disappeared per se. And I don't know enough about the other ones that James was mentioning to know, did they end up in a collector's hands and then were given or were reared on the market again?
I think there's a chance you might be thinking of the Cuthbert Gospel there, which
sure that I'm mixing my manuscripts. So
not to worry. Yes, there was, the Cuthbert Gospel was acquired by the British Museum back in, I think, 2009, 2012, something like that. It was a big 2012 was a big fundraising effort. That's a slightly different manuscript. This one was, and that was on deposit in the British Library from Scion College. This one was very much in Yates Thompson's collection, and he had gotten it from a baronial family where it had kind of lain in a family library for 100 years, and it wasn't entirely clear exactly how it had gotten there. But yeah, it is interesting how these things come back around. And I'm trying to think whether any of the ones that James listed, I think they're all now in some form of accessible library. I'm trying to think if that's, I can't think of any exceptions. Yeah, I think of the 8 he listed, they're all in some form of accessible library. It's just a question of which ones and how they made their way there, and what was said about them between, I guess, kind of 1920-ish and now.
There's a comment. Oh, I was going to point out a comment to this discussion in the chat by Sean Eckhart, but Federico, do you want to respond?
So I wanted to answer to EC in a different way, because the lists, Italy is a completely different case because every city has a different history. So because it was a new nation, and I must have been quite complicated for the ministry at the time, who were the ones who were paying for doing the purchases in auctions. For example, today I was looking how in the Philip sale of 1910, the Italian ambassador actually placed the bids with Quaritch. And then, yeah, each city had a different sort of story and different type of priorities. So this is a completely different panorama. Anyway, I wanted to add that.
And similarly, I'll speak for in Pierre-Louis' absence again, that idea that the big difference between Britain and France and Belgium, and Angéline then might want to say something about Germany, is that the French are actively looking outside their own borders for French, what they define as French manuscripts, which is typically to do with the language, but not exclusively, that are coming up for sale, to buy them back as part of the patrimony. And the British are a long way from doing that. I mean, they're squabbling over whether they can find enough money to save anything, and what the best way is of doing that, while Ormond and the likes of Paul Duria are doing these research trips overseas to identify material that should be brought back to France, and the Belgians are doing the same thing. And Angéline, do you want to say something about that?
And the German as well, the Staats, for example, the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, then Royal Library, bought a lot of books at the Philips's sale as well, including at the auctions, but also bought portion of the collections before, because they were related to Germany. Not exclusively, but a huge amount of them, yes.
And going back to Lynn's point about surprising things, one of the things that surprised me is the number of times some manuscripts cross borders in this period, that things can go from London to Berlin and back to London to New York or Baltimore, or from London to Florence to Paris, or wherever, and that actually there's a lot more movement, and it's more single directional. It's less London. I mean, there's a lot of London to New York, but there's quite a lot of variation on that big exodus as well.
I think also, just to bring us back around and to answer Lynn's question, I think the thing that I have found most surprising is the extent to which in Britain manuscripts are not that big a deal for, let's say, the national art organizations like the National Art Collections Fund, people concerned about the preservation of the national patrimony, as it were, and national heritage. They're not a huge priority, and the prices that are needed for them are not all that enormous. And Sean has made a really interesting comment in the chat about the Luttrell Psalter and the Bedford Hours, and the furore that happened over them about 10 years after the case studies that I gave today. And I think part of why I'm interested in that kind of post-war period, and part of what I presented to the symposium today, is looking at how that idea developed to the point where in 1929 you get £33,000 being spent on a manuscript for the British Museum, whose purchase grant by that point, by 1929, is like, it's like still £1,500, or it's even gone down. It only goes down between 1900 and 1939. It never goes up. And that's not even in real terms. That's just, it never goes down, it goes up. So yeah, I think that's a surprising thing that I've encountered.
Well, great. I think we're right at time, and we need to take a little bit of a break to get set up for the next session. Thank you to Laura, Federico, Olivia, and Angéline for very enriching and exciting presentations. We look forward to hearing more about the project in the coming years. So, and more data entry in the Schoenberg database, as always.
Thank
All right,
you.
well, thank you, everybody.
haven't worked on Junius 85 and 86. Jonathan Wilcox and John Chadbon and Gerald P. Dyson are, the three I'm thinking of right now. But on the whole, it's not really a manuscript people, Old English specialists like to consider. And I think it's because of its sort of like humble decoration. There's a cute little duck as in the bottom right margin of a page. But aside from that, there's like a few nice line fillers, but nothing too extraordinary. But it's so unfortunate because those are the manuscripts that were actually like being circulated, I think, used nearly day to day and hold what I think is the most important context. So we should pay attention to sort of more humble pieces.
Great. I see we have a question from Daniel Davies who has his hand up. Daniel, do you want to go ahead and ask that?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for such great presentations. This has been such a hugely intellectually stimulating presentation for both of them, and they work so nicely together as well. I have a question for Matt, or rather, it's kind of an invitation to consider something I'd just like to hear your thoughts on, which is about the spectrum of testimony that religious literature affords. In your talk, you convincingly discussed the role of the audience here and how the preacher can articulate a kind of trauma his audience have lived through the homily. But what happens when testimony is taken into the body of the reader themselves? And here I'm thinking of like a different kind of religious like writing, like the Psalms, for instance, where when you're reading it, you're kind of in the Psalms and you are performing, being David or whatever. Does this offer a similar form of activated reading that you've been trying to excavate, or is it a more, ineffable form of evidence?
It's definitely something I need to consider, especially since I'm also looking at sort of lyric and the emerging lyric voice, which is so central to articulations of trauma theory, of the lyric I, and intersubjectivity, which sort of gets its start within late 12th, 13th century lyric. It's just a context that's almost irretrievable because it relies so heavily on psychoanalytic frameworks, which are obviously going to be nearly impossible for medieval scholars to get. But I do like that framing because it's still sort of in line with what I'm talking about of like this lyric or psalm can still be shared, even if it is interpersonal in the singular I. But no, I have no cogent answer for you, but I will think more on that. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
And I see in the chat, we have a question from Roger Wick for Hegnar. Did the Getty, during its negotiations with the Armenian Church, seek redress from the Atamian family whence they purchased the tables, the canon table?
Thank you for that question. So for background, I didn't discuss this during my talk, but the Getty had purchased the 8 pages, the canon tables from Mr. Atamian in 1993, if I'm not mistaken. Did they seek redress from him? I don't know, but I know that Mr. Atamian was in his 80s. He was residing in Hawaii, and he was due to be deposed as part of the discovery of the lawsuit, but he passed away before he was deposed. I was never able to speak with him, but I did have a chance to talk to members of his family back in Massachusetts, and especially interesting conversation with his former wife. I'll just say that my impression is that his name was Gil Atamian. He, unlike previous generations of family members who had kept those 8 pages as an heirloom, they didn't know anything about them. They didn't know anything about Toros Roslin, but to them, these were sacred pages that underscored their connection to the old country once they had arrived in Watertown, Massachusetts. Gil Atamian seemed to be a very different kind of person. He was a businessman involved in all kinds of very interesting and colorful business ventures. So the way he came into possession of these pages he was more of a business-oriented person who saw them as possibly something that is a commodity. So yet another way of conceiving of these pages, the continually changing ways in which this fragment has been seen over the course of the 20th century. But to answer your question, I don't know if the Getty had any discussions with Gil Atamian. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I've had a message from Beth Morrison, who, of course, is a curator at the Getty, and I wonder, Beth, if you, oh, there you are. So feel free to go ahead and ask your question. Maybe something to add.
Thanks. Thanks, Roger, for your question, and thanks also, Hegnar, for your paper about the Charles Rosling leaves. I'm just delighted how much attention they've gotten over the past years, because they really are masterworks in the collection, and it's wonderful to have people know about them and interested in their history. Obviously, the lawsuit, there are certain parts that just by policy we can't talk about, but in terms of the family, we were in touch with the family all through. We acquired the leaves in '94. We were in touch with the family all along. And it's my understanding through my research that the Atamian family was actually the Armenian family that brought the leaves over to the United States. I actually found the ship that they sailed on with the information of when they entered the country. So they had been fleeing from the genocide there and were then in the United States with these leaves. And so we were in touch with the family the entire way, but the issues with the legal side of things was never with the family. And so I was just delighted that we were able to continue to have the leaves through the generosity of the Armenian Church and the negotiation, and that we are still able to display them here. And we also still, have other fabulous Armenian objects. And I always hope that people, all sorts of visitors, come to see them because they really are amazing.
Wonderful. I think if we don't have any further questions or comments, we can adjourn and thank our two speakers for a wonderful session, our penultimate session. Thank you so much, Hegnar and Matt, for your talk. We are going to break now for lunch and or whatever meal you might be having, depending on where you are in the world. And we're going to reconvene at 2 p.m. Eastern time. So in about 45 minutes to hear our keynote, Elaine Traharn from Stanford University. And I think in the meantime, as we did yesterday and the day before, we're going to run on a loop the lightning round videos. So you can feel free to stay in the Zoom room if you like. Otherwise, you can rejoin for the keynote at 2 p.m. So thanks, everyone, and see you soon.
And Nick, I just noticed that there's a question from someone else that if Hegnar, if you're willing to stay on, maybe you could type that into the chat.
Sure.